You have seen this map. 12 colored regions across the Holy Land, 10 of them under question marks. 10 tribes lost. They weren't. The Assyrian king who deported them recorded the actual number on his own clay cylinder. 27,290. Not a population, a governing and military elite. A small city, not a country. Tens of thousands of Israelites stayed in the land. They intermarried with the colonists Sargon imported, and they became the people the New Testament still calls Samaritans 700 years later. The 10 lost tribes were never lost. The paper trail runs deep. Hebrew names appear on Assyrian payrolls 100 years after the deportation. A prophetess walks into the temple courts of Luke chapter 2 and names her own lost tribe out loud. If you grew up in church, you have carried this question your whole life. Where did they go? Sargon's count comes from his own royal annals, the kind of inscription a king commissioned to celebrate a victory. He had no reason to undercount. If anything, kings inflated these numbers to look more impressive. If you have ever felt the gap between the Bible story you absorbed in childhood and the actual historical record, this is where that gap starts to close. Sargon's count was the number he took in 722 BC. But the deportation didn't begin in 722 BC, so who was already gone before Sargon ever crossed the border? Imagine a wave hitting a beach. It does not arrive in a single line. It comes in pulses. 1 foot of water, then a pause, then another foot. Sargon's number was the second wave, not the first. The deportations happened in 2 stages, 10 years apart, under 2 different Assyrian kings. And the first stage swept different tribes than the second. By the time Sargon claimed credit for the fall of Samaria, the kingdom of Israel had already been bleeding tribes for years. Open 2 Kings 15 verse 29, and you'll see the name of the king who took the first wave. Tiglath-Pileser III. He came down through Galilee, around 733 BC, and deported the cities of Naphtali. The northern hill country emptied that year, a full decade before Sargon's march on Samaria. The same king crossed the Jordan River. 1 Chronicles 5 verse 26 names him by his Babylonian throne name, Pul, and lists the tribes he carried away. Tiglath-Pileser was his Assyrian regnal name. Pulu was the throne name he took when he claimed the kingship of Babylon in 729 BC. The Reubenites, the Gadites, the half-tribe of Manasseh. 3 more tribes, gone. That's already 4 of the so-called 10 lost tribes deported a full decade before Sargon's name appears in the story. Sargon II came in to finish what Tiglath-Pileser III had started. Samaria fell in 722 BC under a 3rd Assyrian king, Shalmaneser V, who died during the siege. Sargon took credit for the deportation that finalized it. If you have ever read 2 Kings 17 and assumed the deportation was a single moment, this is the part the chapter doesn't pause to walk you through. The end of the northern kingdom was not a single event. It was a slow bleed, across a decade. 2 kings, 2 waves, 1 kingdom emptied piece by piece. Notice what just happened to the math. 2 waves of deportation, 10 years apart. 4 tribes, Reuben, Gad, half Manasseh, and Naphtali, were already in Assyrian hands before Samaria fell. Of the 10 lost tribes, 3 of them never actually fit the deportation story at all. So which 3, and why are they on the list in the first place? If a school of 50 students disappeared from a town, you would not say the town lost 50 children if 3 of them had transferred years earlier and never been on the rolls. The math has to be honest before the mystery is real. The phrase 10 lost tribes assumes 10 tribes who were there to be lost. 3 of those 10 don't survive the assumption. Levi is the easiest to see. Levi was never deported as a tribe because Levi had no land to be deported from. Open Joshua 21 and you can count the cities yourself. 48 Levitical cities, scattered across the territories of every other tribe. Levi's role was the priesthood, the temple, and the teaching of the law. The Levites were already distributed by design, generations before any Assyrian king crossed the border. Simeon is harder to see, but the text tells you. Simeon's tribal allotment in Joshua 19 is geographically surrounded by Judah. By the time of Moses' final blessings in Deuteronomy 33, Simeon is missing entirely from the list. Most scholars read this as an absorption. Simeon dissolved into Judah, generations before the kingdom split, generations before Assyria became a threat. Benjamin is the strangest of the 3, because the tribe of Benjamin survived everything. When Solomon's kingdom split in 1 Kings 12, Benjamin stayed on Judah's side. The southern kingdom was Judah and Benjamin together. Saul was a Benjaminite. the Apostle Paul was a Benjaminite. He says it himself in Romans chapter 11. The tribe of Benjamin walked into the New Testament with its identity completely intact. Israel Finkelstein, who has spent his career studying the archaeology of the Israelite kingdoms, treats the 12-tribe count as a literary mechanism. Levi out, Joseph split into Ephraim and Manasseh. The number stays at 12, no matter how the underlying reality shifts. If you have ever assumed the Bible's tribal lists were stable, you weren't wrong to assume that. Or just told a smoother story than the text actually tells. Look at the math now. 3 of the 10 lost tribes were administrative reassignments, not Assyrian disappearances. The math of 10 lost tribes only works if you count those reassignments as the same kind of loss. Empires have a strange habit. They keep the names of the people they conquer, not out of respect for the paperwork. Tax rolls, ration lists, canal dredging crews, the names survive in places no one was supposed to be reading 3,000 years later. 2 Kings 17 verse 6 says the deportees were settled in 4 specific places: Hala, the Habor, the river of Gozan, the cities of the Medes. The biblical record is detailed. The question is whether any of those settlements left a record on the other side. They did. Cuneiform tablets recovered from a site called Dur-Katlimmu, modern Tel Sheikh Hamad in Syria, record the names of workers on Assyrian canal maintenance crews in the 7th century BC. That is 100 years after the deportation. And among those names appear Hebrew theophoric names. A theophoric name is a name that contains the name of a god. In this case, the god is Yahweh, the Israelite God. The signature form of that divine name only shows up in Hebrew. One of those names is Yeho-Ahu. It means Yahweh is brother. A descendant of one of the deported tribes was working on an Assyrian canal crew 100 years after his grandparents were marched out of Samaria, naming his children after the God of Israel. Stop and picture that for a second. A Hebrew name on an Assyrian payroll, baked into a clay tablet by a scribe who had no idea you would ever read it. The deportees did not vanish into history. They appear in someone else's bookkeeping. Alive, working, naming their children after the God of Israel 100 years after they were taken. If you are finding things in this video that you have never heard pulled together this way before, share it with someone who loves digging into how the Bible actually fits with a historical record. Subscribing keeps these coming. So let us take a breath and look at where we've been. The story we inherited was that 10 tribes were deported in one event in 722 BC and vanished. The Assyrian records tell a different story. 2 waves of deportation a decade apart, 3 of the 10 tribes never really part of the deportation, and the 7 that were taken, leaving a paper trail in the very empire that carried them off. We are about halfway home. The rest covers the people left behind, the modern claims of descent, and a single sentence in Luke chapter 2 that quietly closes the case. Hebrew names showed up on Assyrian payrolls a century later. But what happened to the Israelites who weren't deported, the tens of thousands left behind in the land? Walk through any harbor town in any century, and the people you meet are never one ancestry. They are the layered residue of every ship that ever docked. The northern hill country of Israel after 722 BC was a harbor town. Imagine a river that empties into the sea. You stand at the mouth and watch the fresh water disappear into salt. You can no longer separate one drop from the next. But the water did not vanish. It became part of something larger, and the river kept flowing into it long after you stopped watching. The 10 tribes did not evaporate. They emptied, slowly, generation by generation, into the populations that surrounded them. The records of that pouring out are preserved on clay tablets the Assyrians themselves baked into permanence. Sargon deported 27,000. He also imported colonists from 5 different cities. 2 Kings 17, verse 24, names them: Babylon, Cuthah, Hamath, Avva, Sepharvaim. The colonists did not arrive into an empty land. They arrived into a land of Israelites. The colonists intermarried with the Israelites who remained. 2 Kings 17 verse 33 describes the religious result in one of the quietly devastating sentences in the Hebrew Bible. They feared the Lord and served their own gods. That is not a description of disappearance. That is a description of fusion. Read that sentence out loud sometime. They feared the Lord and served their own gods. The Samaritan people are the genealogical, religious, and cultural product of that fusion. Israelite plus imported colonist. Retained tribal memory plus foreign cult. This is why the Samaritans of the New Testament have a temple on Mount Gerizim. Why they accept the first 5 books of the Bible but reject the prophets. Why the Judean Jews of the Gospels treat them as cousins who aren't quite. Zvi Ben-Dor Benit traces this entire fusion in his book, The 10 Lost Tribes, A World History. His conclusion is that the Samaritans are not a separate ethnic group that arrived from somewhere else. They are what the lost tribes became while staying home. If you have ever wondered why the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4 says our father Jacob to Jesus and means it, this is why. She wasn't making it up. She was a great many times over granddaughter of one of those tribes. The Samaritans are the assimilation product of the Israelites who stayed, plus the colonists Sargon imported. The 10 lost tribes did not vanish. Half of them turned into the people the New Testament is still naming centuries later. The Samaritans are part of the answer to the title question, but for centuries, people have claimed to be the descendants of the other half, the ones who were actually deported. Every family has a story about a great-great-grandparent that may or may not be true. Multiply that by an entire tribe across 3,000 years, and you get the next part of this video. For centuries, groups around the world have claimed descent from the deported tribes. Some claims partially hold up, others don't. The picture is more interesting than either side wants. The Beta Israel of Ethiopia have claimed descent from the tribe of Dan for centuries. A 2010 genetic study comparing whole DNA profiles across populations found their genetic profile clusters more closely with neighboring Ethiopian groups than with Levantine Jewish populations. Israeli rabbinic authorities still recognize them as Jews and helped airlift tens of thousands of them to Israel in the 1980s. The genetic record and the lineage claim don't match cleanly, and both have weight. The Bene Israel of India tell a different version of the same story. A 2016 study confirmed two signals in their DNA: ancient Jewish ancestry, traceable; Indian admixture, ancient and substantial. They are a fusion population, like the Samaritans before them. A hand turning the page, soft museum-style lighting, bold, saturated biblical illustration with rich earth tones, historical textbook style with clean, bold outlines, slightly stylized, vibrant and dramatic warm lighting. No text, no letters, no words, no labels of any kind. No nudity, no exposed skin. The illustration fills the entire frame, edge to edge. British Israelism, the claim that Anglo-Saxon peoples are the lost tribes, originated with John Wilson in 1840. It has no scholarly support. Mainstream archaeology, linguistics, and genetics all reject it. It is what historians call pseudo-history, which means a history claim that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints teaches that a remnant of the northern tribes will return as a distinct group in the last days. Mainstream biblical scholarship doesn't share that expectation. Most scholars summarize the answer the same way. The deported populations assimilated into the broader Mesopotamian and Median worlds. Partial descent traces survive in pockets. Mythologized claims of complete tribal continuity do not. If you have ever wondered why some communities feel an unshakable certainty about ancient ancestry that scholars cannot confirm, this is the territory you are standing in. Memory is a stubborn thing. Sometimes it preserves real connections. Sometimes it preserves a story that the family wanted to be true. Some descent claims partially hold up under genetic and historical scrutiny. Others are pseudo-history. The honest answer to who the descendants are is not a single clean lineage. The tribes were lost, the way water is lost when it flows downstream. Some of it pools, some of it evaporates, some of it ends up in places nobody expected. Modern descent claims return mixed results. But there is one ancient claim, recorded in the New Testament, that a member of one of the 10 lost tribes was identified by name in the temple courts of Jerusalem, 700 years after the deportation. There is a kind of evidence that survives because nobody bothered to falsify it. A name in a passing detail, an afterthought in someone else's biography. The strongest single piece of evidence that the 10 lost tribes were not lost is hiding in 3 words of Luke chapter 2 that almost nobody quotes. You have probably read past this verse a dozen times. Luke chapter 2, verse 36. Anna the prophetess, 84 years old, a widow. And then Luke does something almost nobody pauses on. He tells us her tribe, of the tribe of Asher. 3 words. Asher's territory was in northwest Galilee. The same Galilee Tiglath-Pileser III had swept through in 733 BC. The same hill country, emptied a decade before Sargon's name appeared on the Khorsabad Cylinder. 700 years before Anna walked into the temple, The maps had stopped printing the borders of Asher. And yet Luke names her tribe. Not as a guess, not as a flourish, as if it were a known and traceable identity in the 1st century AD. Read that sentence out loud one more time. Of the tribe of Asher. If you have ever doubted that the Bible tracks its own history with a kind of care that survives even an empire, this is what that care looks like. Anna's tribal identity outlived her tribe's territory by 7 centuries. And Luke wrote it down, because to him and his readers, the identity was still real. Picture an old woman in a temple courtyard. 84 years old, a widow, a prophetess. She walks up to a young couple holding a baby, and before she speaks, she introduces herself by a tribal name no map of her time still printed. Asher. Northwest Galilee. A tribe Tiglath-Pileser III had supposedly erased 700 years before she was born. She holds out her hand toward the baby, and every word she says is a refutation of the idea that her people had been lost. The 10 lost tribes were never lost. They were deported, assimilated, scattered, intermarried, and remembered. And one of them stood in the temple courts of Jerusalem, holding out her hand toward an infant Jesus. She identified herself out loud by the name of a tribe the world had stopped writing on its maps. If this video gave you a piece of the Bible you didn't have before,